The story you are about to hear may contain detailed descriptions of intense violence. It will certainly be worse than fiction.
Hello, my name is Les. Thank you for joining me as we take a look at a true tale of unimaginable horror.
Hey guys, this is Julia from Always Time for True Crime. Every week, I get into a new case about murder, missing persons, and serial killers. My podcast is all about the lesser-known cases. So, if you're looking for something beyond Ted Bundy or JonBenet Ramsey, head on over to Always Time for True Crime for some new true crime stories. You can listen to Always Time for True Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, Stitcher, and more.
Big shout out to TZ of the Tapes from the Dark Side podcast for voicing the content warning of this episode. I'll be asking other podcasters in the future to do the same. I think it's cool to mix it up sometimes, and hopefully I can get some great podcasters to help. The guy who voiced the standard warning might actually be familiar to some of you. His name is Mike Delgadio, and along with being an audiobook narrator, a commercial voice actor, and awesome YouTuber, he also does some of the narration for the No Sleep podcast, which is a huge horror fiction podcast. I was very happy when I sent him an email, and 2 days later, he sent me 5 different versions of the warning. Now, I don't normally do this kind of intro, so we'll keep it short. On to it. And here we are with part 2 of London After Midnight. I didn't mention it in the last episode because, frankly, I forgot. A while back, I put a question out on the Facebook page asking for suggestions of a good name for this story. There were several that I liked, but I based the winner on which one had the most likes. Thus, we ended up with London After Midnight, which was suggested by a fellow podcaster that some of you may know. JD Horror from True Crime Horror Story came up with it and got the most likes, so thanks JD. I have a little tiny bit of a correction to episode 10. When I told the part about Bernard Spilsbury's suicide, I speculated that maybe his numerous years as a crime scene investigator was the main contributor to his suicide. Since then, I've found information that it was actually financial strain that pushed him to that decision. It was actually in his suicide note, but I had postulated in my own head that he must have been suffering PTSD after all the horrible things he had seen. It could have still been a factor, and as I understand it, people who choose to end their own life are often suffering from numerous hardships leading up to it. We're going to pick up where we left off in the first episode, which was right in the middle of the investigation of the murder of Evelyn Hamilton in the West End of London. She had just been identified by the landlady of a boarding house not far from the crime scene. During this investigation, the detectives following up weren't aware that another dead woman had been discovered in her home, and it was a horrific crime scene. So without further ado, let's get into the story. I hope you enjoy, if that's the right word for it. Detectives Freshney and Claire took Catherine back to the boarding house, then made their way to the eatery that she recommended to Evelyn the night before she was found dead. The Lion's Corner House at Marble Arch. That's Lion with a Y. First impressions of the facade of the establishment were unsurprisingly familiar. The windows were covered with a lattice of tape to prevent violent shattering in the event that a bomb fell nearby. A common fortification for many businesses in Great Britain during the Nazi bombing campaign. Inside, it was almost as if the carnage of the war ceased as they crossed the threshold, and the detectives were met with folks having tea, eating lunch, and socializing. They were keeping calm and carrying on. The two men approached a young waitress who was serving customers and announced themselves, then inquired about Evelyn. They showed her photos of the outfit Evelyn was wearing and of her lying on the autopsy table. She immediately recognized her and said, "She came in here Sunday night. The time was about midnight and she was alone looking for a seat." They talked for a couple more minutes, and although the waitress remembered seeing her, she didn't serve her or otherwise interact with Evelyn. She simply remembered what time it was and her appearance. Other waitresses who worked that Sunday night also recalled her and said that she ate her meal and left shortly before 1 a.m. They said that as she was walking away down the street, she was approached by a young man, but they thought nothing of it and heard nothing out of the ordinary. Not even bombs falling, which honestly was fairly ordinary. Armed with eyewitness accounts and a reasonable identification of her body, detectives set out to find relatives of the unfortunate woman. It wasn't long. In fact, it was within a day of Catherine giving them her name that her sister Kathleen was found in Newcastle, and she immediately made her way to the morgue in London. Yet again, and this time from someone close to her, Evelyn's body was identified with certainty. Kathleen was heartbroken at the loss of her sister, which would haunt her for the rest of her life. This wasn't a case of the air raids that struck fear across Britain. This wasn't the obvious risk that Londoners face daily. This was a heinous murder that took her. An up-close and personal murder motivated by sexual desires. But Evelyn was a loner type. Most of the people that police talked to that knew her said as much. She was so distrusting of others that she didn't even use banks to store her money. She carried it in her bag everywhere she went. Her sister stated that she never knew of her to speak much with potential suitors or have any intimate relationships. I've never known her to court anyone, and I do not know any of her friends. As far as I know, she has never had a man friend. She wouldn't have been charmed into trusting a stranger. He had to have taken her by force. Detective Claire believed that she was grabbed, and the strangulation began immediately, preventing her from screaming for help. One officer patrolling the area at around 5:20 a.m. came across a young man who seemed to be in a hurry. His light-colored hair was messy, and he was clad in a Royal Air Force uniform and carried a gas mask case. He approached the patrolman and said, "Excuse me, but do you know the way to King's Cross?" He pointed him in the right direction and went back to his parole as the young man walked off.
Good evening, ghouls and fools, and welcome to the Midwest Horror Co. podcast, where we discuss all things horror. My name is Christian, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Joey Rice, and welcome to the podcast where we all float. Hey Christian, what can our listeners expect to hear about on our show?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Joey. On this podcast, we're going to be discussing all things horror. So that includes movies, books, true crime, urban legends, anything related to horror. If it freaks you out, we're going to be talking about it. Hey Joey, where can our listeners find us?
Our listeners can find us all over social media. You guys can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and all streaming platforms. Just search Midwest Horror Co. Make sure you guys go give us a like, a follow, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay tuned on future content that we're excited to deliver for you guys. Until next time, stay spooky.
And don't look under the bed.
The officer thought nothing of it. Perhaps he was just out for a night on the town, but he stayed a bit too late and needed to get back to his quarters quickly. It wasn't uncommon for soldiers, and the officer wasn't going to give him a hard time over it. Evelyn Hamilton was born on February 8, 1901, in or near Newcastle, and went on to be fairly successful, working in several pharmacies. She traveled around quite a bit, and in 1941 got a job as a salesperson with a pharmaceutical company in Leicestershire. Shortly before her murder in the early morning hours after her 41st birthday, she had taken a job at a pharmacy in Grimsby. The night she was killed was the last night she planned on staying in London before taking a train to her new home to the north. The detectives know who she is at this point, but are at a complete loss as to who could have done this to her. The only clue they had was that her killer was left-handed, a detail that will be a significant one as this story unfolds further. At the end of the last episode, I mentioned that another dead woman had been found not far from the first crime scene in the Soho district. This time, it was in the victim's own home, and not long after Miss Hamilton's body was found. February 10th, 1942, precisely 24 hours after a dead Evelyn Hamilton was found. 2 meter readers entered an apartment building on Wardour Street at around 8 a.m. The meters were coin-fed and they came to collect the money from them. A neighbor told the men that there were 2 other tenants in the building and she took them to the next door over. It was occupied by a woman named, get this, Evelyn Oatley. Not to be confused with Evelyn Hamilton, the first victim. The woman who accompanied them, Ivy, said she thought Evelyn, who we'll call Miss Oatley, might be asleep, but she knocked on her door anyway. They just wanted the money, then they'd leave. The door wasn't fully closed, and as she knocked, it inched open slowly to a dark and quiet apartment. One of the men went in calmly, pulled out his flashlight, and cut through the room with it, toward a bed that had a woman lying on it. Upon seeing her, all 3 immediately left and ran down the stairs and outside to call for police. There just so happened to be an officer patrolling on foot just down the street. We just found a dead woman at 153 Wardour, one of the men said. The 3 quickly led Inspector John Hennessy up to her apartment, where he carefully entered with his own flashlight, casting a pale beam into the room. It was daylight at this point, but the blackout curtains were still drawn, leaving the apartment cast in a deep darkness. He saw the obviously dead body of a woman laying on the bed with her head hanging over the edge, with the interior of her throat laid bare by a large gash all the way across it, and a pool of blood on the floor beneath. He turned around and went back out of the apartment and told Charles Fueling, one of the meter readers, "You're going to have to help on this. Go to Trenchard House and have a message sent to West End Central Station. Tell them a divisional surgeon and a divisional detective inspector are needed at these premises immediately." Inspector Hennessy wanted to stay put and protect the crime scene from any possible disturbance from curious bystanders. Fueling did as he was told, and at around 8:50 a.m., Alexander Baldy arrived at the crime scene. He was the surgeon on duty, and he set to work immediately by opening the blackout curtains and getting an initial look at the situation. He approached her body while observing the roughly cut opening across her neck and laid his hand on her midsection. She was cold, nearly the same temperature as the crisp morning air outside the building. Baldy gave an estimation of the time of death to be around 3 or 4 hours earlier. Detective Inspector Clarence Jeffrey arrived within minutes after the doctor did, and Baldy gave him a general rundown. Surgeons tend to diagnose medical conditions. They don't typically scour crime scenes for the tiniest of clues as to what happened. They focus on the patient and their condition and leave the rest of it to seasoned detectives. Inspector Jeffrey cataloged the crime scene and scrutinized the room with an eye for detail. He focused on putting a story together, and it became clear very quickly that he was looking at the work of a madman. Her throat had been laid wide open, but it was roughly cut, and appeared to have been slashed at dozens of times. Next to her head was the blade from one of those old-school safety razors. I still use one of those, by the way. They're the best. It was covered in blood, and it was obviously the weapon used to cut and slice at her neck. Next to the razor blade, there was a pair of curling tongs that had blood on them. Jeffrey scanned her body carefully and came across a metallic object protruding from her vagina. It was a flashlight that had been rammed about 4 inches into her, and he noticed numerous cuts, punctures, and tearing around her vaginal and pubic area. A bloody can opener lay between her legs, and this was the old-school type that was basically a small spear that you would literally stab the cans with. The perpetrator had used the can opener in and around her genitals to torture this poor woman in her final moments. The bed was otherwise neat and hadn't been slept in or disturbed in any noticeable way. After his initial assessment, Inspector Jeffrey sent Hennessy to contact Superintendent Sherrill and request his presence. It was noon when Sherrill arrived, and he was quickly joined by Sir Spilsbury. Spilsbury's keen eye would catch a few details that Jeffrey and Dr. Baldy missed. Sherrill began collecting evidence as Spilsbury examined Evelyn's body. Around the horrific gash in her neck, he noted deep bruising. Blood vessels in her eyes had burst, and there was hemorrhaging on the tissues inside her mouth. She had been manually strangled before her throat was slashed. The blood on the floor, though, suggests that she didn't die from the asphyxia, but rather blood loss. The killer rendered her unconscious, slashed her throat, then went about mutilating her genitals with the tongs and can opener before forcing the flashlight into her vagina. Spilsbury turned to Inspector Gray, who took charge of the scene as Hennessy left, and said, "These bled little. They were probably inflicted when she was on the verge of death after the cut to the neck. I'll know more after a full post-mortem," as he pointed to the cuts and punctures around her genitals. Spilsbury packed his equipment up, and Gray ordered the body to be sent to the mortuary for a full analysis. Spilsbury went about the autopsy, confirming his initial theories. In a better lit room, he was able to determine that whoever strangled this woman was left-handed. The bruising on her neck revealed as much, just as in the case of Evelyn Hamilton. The fingerprints that Superintendent Sherrill lifted from the various items collected from her flat also appeared to have been those of a left-handed man. Remember that though these were the early days of fingerprint analysis, Sherrill was possibly the best, and he had already nailed a number of criminals with his methods. He was a natural, and if he said it, it was most likely true. Now, he had to find a match. No simple task by any means, but once he determined which finger a print was made with, he could go through the meticulously organized records only looking for a match to that digit. For example, the files were organized into 10 sections, one for each finger. If the print he was looking for was the left-hand index finger, he only needed to look at one file from each person's record, the left index finger. This was a system that he had developed himself, and it greatly sped up the process. Once he found a match for that print, he could then compare the other prints to that person for a certain identification. It was brilliant, and once again, a method used up until computers took over the painstaking work.
My name is Paige, and I'm the host of Reverie True Crime. Reverie means to daydream, but even daydreams can become nightmares. Come join me and get lost in horrific reverie about true crimes and eerie events. Reverie True Crime Podcast, available wherever you stream your favorite podcasts.
It dawned on Cheryl that perhaps the man who killed Oatley was the same man who killed Hamilton. He compared prints taken from the Hamilton crime scene to those from Oatley's, but he couldn't rule them a match. Still, he thought the two murders were connected in some way. Both were committed by a left-handed man, but Evelyn Oatley's murder was a far more brutal and sadistic crime. Maybe he just had more time to work, and in a private setting, he could fulfill his dark fantasies unhindered. It was Wednesday, February 11th, 1942, when Evelyn's husband, Harry Oatley, came to London to positively identify her body in the morgue. He was said to be a simple farmer who wanted to live a quiet, rural life, whereas Evelyn loved living in the city and aspired to be a famous actress. Despite their separation, he still loved his wife, and she loved him, but her ambitions drove them apart. They had been married for about 6 years, and there was always the condition that if she ever grew tired or bored of country life, that she would be allowed to go to the city to pursue her dreams, and that's exactly what she did. He was aware of her profession as a sex worker, but stuck by her side and would even come to London from Blackpool to stay with her for a week every once in a while. He could never convince her to go back with him, though. She was attractive and outgoing and destined to be a star, but didn't live to see her 36th birthday or the return of normal life after the war. "That's her," he said, as her face was revealed from beneath the sheet that covered her. He was devastated and hadn't a single clue as to who could have murdered her in such a brutal fashion. Evelyn was 35 years old and had spent some time working as an actress before the Nazis came to the shores of England. The London bombings obviously affected show business, and while out of acting roles, she would perform sex work to make ends meet. Even on nights that she would take off, she was known to bring older men to her apartment for the evening to keep her company and make her feel at ease during the blackouts. The military, both British and American, provided a big chunk of a sex worker's clientele during World War II, but they were mostly younger than Oatley. They weren't her type. She preferred older gentlemen who wouldn't be so rough with her. It wouldn't be long until word of the two murders were being spread among the working girls in Soho and beyond, which brought fear and caution. The footsteps behind them, an unfamiliar face in a dark alley, were met with dread at the thought of these murders in the back of their minds. The night before Oatley was found dead, she had been fraternizing in a bar, and when she left, she met up with some of the other girls just outside. Anne, one of her colleagues, approached her from behind and said, "Evelyn, how's things?" To which she replied, "Quiet." There were a few soldiers nearby checking the girls out, and one of them was giving Evelyn a glance that hinted at his interest. Though he wasn't her type, she found him attractive. He was probably about mid-20s with light, sandy hair, slim build, and a charming smile. When he approached her, she asked him what kind of woman he likes, and he said, "I like blondes." Ivy, the neighbor who led the meter readers to her apartment, said that she saw her come into the building with a man clad in military garb, then go into her flat. She heard them talking through the walls, then eventually she heard Evelyn's radio emanating big band music. This was common, as Evelyn used the music to cover the noises that would be produced. During all of this, a 28-year-old RAF officer in training had been returning to his barracks at odd hours of the morning after parting ways with some of his buddies the previous nights. Their curfew was 10:30 p.m., but these young men would often break that rule in favor of some red light district fun. On the morning that Evelyn Hamilton was found dead, his bunkmate Felix snuck into the barracks after a late-night romp himself. He woke the young man and asked him when he had came back, and he said 3:30. He then drifted back to sleep before being roused again and asked, "What happened to you last night? Why didn't you come back to meet me?" He answered, "The woman I went with didn't satisfy me, so I went and found someone else." The soldier in question, Gordon Cummins, had parted ways with Felix the previous evening, February 9th, after they had both hired the services of a couple working girls, Laura and Molly, outside the Monaco restaurant. Gordon had shown Felix a wad of money earlier in that day and told him he got it from someone who was repaying a debt. Felix thought nothing of it, and since Gordon wanted to pay for the night out, he was on board. They were both married men, but enjoyed the company of the local girls from time to time. They could be bombed into oblivion at any moment, so they had whatever kind of fun they wanted. Gordon took a liking to Laura after noticing that she was his type, blonde and curvy. He too was her type, tall and handsome with light sandy hair and an impressive smile filled with white teeth. He was well-spoken and charming with an elegant, almost regal accent. For years, Gordon claimed to be related to nobility, and his buddies jokingly called him Duke or Count. Felix was chatting with Molly and working out a price for her work, and when the two agreed to £1 for everything, Molly took Felix to a room she rented nearby. Laura looked at Gordon as Molly and Felix walked on and asked him what he liked. He replied, "Blondes." The two then went to Laura's flat on Frith Street, where they also agreed on a price of £1. He paid her up front, then gave her 30 extra shillings for some extra time with her. The two went to business, and about 10 minutes into the tryst, the drunk soldier wasn't able to keep an erection. Whiskey dick, I guess. He just laughed it off, surprisingly, and said, "I think I've had too much to drink." He rested for a few minutes, then woke his little man back up and went at it a second time, lasting about 15 minutes before the same situation deflated his fun. The two sat up in front of the electric stove, still naked, and Gordon began running his fingers through her hair, saying things like, "I like your hair, Blondie. I like blondes." He began masturbating, and as it escalated, she could feel him tugging on her hair harder and harder with each passing second. Eventually, he finished and released his grip. They sat in silence for a while before Gordon said, "Sorry for keeping you so long, Blondie. I really did drink too much." The two got dressed, and she walked him out of the building and down the street toward the restaurant where they met. When they reached the Eros News Theater, she asked him if he would be okay to go alone, and he said, "Of course. I wish you all the best tonight, Blondie. I hope you make lots of money." He smiled at her, then slowly faded into the darkness as he continued down the unlit street. Felix had been waiting at the restaurant for about half an hour before he went his own way. His time with Molly lasted only about 15 minutes, so he had been there since about 11:30 p.m., and it was now past midnight. He carried on and decided that going back to the base would be a terrible waste at this point. Might as well find something else to do. He was already well beyond curfew, and if he was to be reprimanded, it might as well be worth it. He went to an underground station in Piccadilly Circus where throngs of London's citizens would take refuge at night in defense against the bombings. There, Felix met another young lady of the night, and she offered her services. He found her attractive and he wasn't ready to go back to his barracks just yet, so he agreed and the two got tickets to take the train to her neighborhood. They went to her apartment where he stayed for several hours before he finally decided it was time to sneak back into his bunk. He made his way up the fire escape and to the flat he shared with 6 other prospective RAF officers, one of which was Gordon Cummins. This was where he found Gordon asleep, just 2 hours before the body of Evelyn Oatley was discovered in her flat. After the quiet and brief questioning of Gordon, Felix decided it was time to finally hit the sheets, so he got into his bunk and drifted off. The morning alarm sounded for the cadets in less than an hour, and they got up, organized their bunks, ate breakfast, and did morning drills. By this point, Evelyn Oatley's apartment was already buzzing with police and detectives from Scotland Yard. You're gonna love this. That's it for episode 11. I want to thank you for listening as always, and guess what? This has turned into a 3-part series. There's just too much to get through to keep it at 2, so there will be more. If you like the podcast, you can help me out by spreading the word. Tell your friends and family who are into this kind of podcast and share it in groups. You can leave a rating and review if you want to, but despite what most podcasters believe, that has nothing to do with rankings. The only way to climb the ranks is by getting new listeners. The best way to do that is, well, talking about it. Another great way you can help me out is by joining the Patreon. You'll get to see my ugly mug struggle through the recording process of each episode live. It'll also help cover the costs of the website, hosting, and other subscriptions I use to create this show.